Liberia is a topic that I always like to talk about, and I mean, for obvious reason, it's because it is my home, and secondly, because it has a very rich and very interesting, sometimes complicated history. So what I'm going to be doing here with the time given to me, I will try by all means to sort of narrow it down so that we fit within the time. Otherwise, when it comes to Liberia, I could talk here for the next 3, 4, 5 hours. But it's interesting with what is happening over the past decade or two, with Liberians being seen all over the world. Liberians before, by nature, were not travelers. But something happened over the last at least 2 or close to 3 decades that sent Liberians traveling all over the world. What I want to do here from the beginning is there is something that stands in the very center of our history that I want to just let you know as a way of beginning. And that is the civil war that Liberia suffered for about nearly 15 years. And that is what sent Liberians all over the world to seek refuge in various countries.
But I remember meetings where Scowcroft's deputy, Robert Gates, who had come from the CIA, he was denigrating the historical relationship. He says it's meaningless, it doesn't govern us anymore, we treat Liberia just like any other country, and we have no real interest there.
Dole also wanted the U.S. to step in, to keep himself in power.
Being a lover of democracy, America would have stepped in to put stop to the bloodshed. But then they, I don't know what they're thinking of. But we are still hoping that America will join us in searching for peace for this country.
By mid-1990, Taylor's troops had captured most of the country and were advancing rapidly on Monrovia. Dole's situation was growing desperate.
We had an aircraft available in Freetown ready to pick him up. We told him that, but actually I was supposed to go there and say, okay, now's the time. Get your family and everyone and get in the plane, let's go. But I never got to that point. It was vetoed.
We are not going to let any criminal be taken out of this country by anyone. No one is taken to, he will be caught by us or killed by us.
I think we could have done some things differently at the end, but the Bush administration pulled us back and told us that they didn't want us to do that because they didn't want to accept any degree of moral responsibility for Charles Taylor becoming the next head of state of Liberia. I think that was a mistake.
I felt that the White House had an error of judgment at that point. Whatever would have happened with Taylor after that, at least the country would have been spared the devastation of its infrastructure and all of its facilities there.
Liberians sought help everywhere. Finally, it was the 16-nation Economic Community of West African States that created ECOMOG, a special military peacekeeping force.
Je me suis impliqué, disons, dans le processus de paix au Liberia en ma qualité de président de la CEDEAO. Mais comme je l'ai dit plus tôt, c'est vrai que aucun Africain, aucun homme, je pense, de cœur, ne peut accepter de voir des souffrances aussi insupportables que celles endurées par le peuple libérien.
The presence of peacekeepers gave Monrovia a fragile sense of security. But Taylor was still threatening to launch a final assault if Dole didn't resign.
remain here to fight the support of Jack Taylor.
Leave it there. The last guy who was talking was the former president of he was first the military leader and then became civilian president later. But he was the one who was assassinated by the rebels when they came and attacked Liberia. I want to start by talking about the history of Liberia. The topic here tonight is Liberia yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It's easy to talk about the yesterday. It's easy to talk about the today. It's a little bit difficult to talk about the tomorrow because this history has been everywhere. And so, but we're going to try to talk about that as time goes on. There's an African idiom that says that the soul of a house is in the foundation. And what that means is that if the foundation is not laid right, the house is going to be in problem throughout. So it is with the history of this little beautiful country called Liberia. But many times when historians are beginning to talk about Liberia, they are sidetracked by the recent history of that country, so they start right there. But I want to take us a little bit beyond the recent history, and that might probably explain to us the reason why this little country has had such a troublesome history. Many historians will start from the arrival of the free slaves from the United States. But before then, in 12th century, there were tribes living in Liberia. Between 12th to 14th century, there was this group called the Mende group, now a tribal group. They live in Sierra Leone. Historians and archaeologists say that these tribes and many other West African tribes once inhabited the land of Sudan. So by 12th to 14th century, this tribe, the Mende tribe, was a large tribe. And they had a problem. The desertification, which was the Sahara Desert growing and coming down, sort of forced some of these tribes to move and look for wetter land. And that's what happened with the Mende tribe. It was a huge tribe, so as they were moving, as they moved, the smaller tribes ahead of this tribe began to move towards the coastal area. And today, tribes like the Dey, the Bassa, the Kru, the Gula, and Kisi tribes, these are all tribes that are presently in Liberia. This is how they arrived there. And even my own tribe, my own tribal history too, is connected to that. So that's how these tribes came to this land that is now called Liberia. And that was from 12th to about 14th century. Liberia, this country that we now call Liberia, once belonged to one of the many African empires. This empire was called the Weah Empire. And that was from 1450 to 1898. When this tribe came down to where Liberia is today to inhabit that area, they brought along with them things like skills like cotton spinning, cloth weaving, iron smelting, cultivating of rice, and social and political institutions. They got these skills from the old empires that they once belonged to. Slave trade itself is believed to have started in 14th to 15th century. This was when black Africans were being taken and sold into slavery. It is believed that the Arab traders who came from up, going downwards in Africa, got to the western tip of Africa, and they began this slave trade, capturing black Africans and selling them. By 1461 and the late 17th century, people from sailors and traders from Portugal and the Dutch and the British traders enter the West African region, and they started trading posts along the coastal area. The Portuguese especially were there because of one commodity that they were seeking. This was a hot commodity by those days. And that commodity is a certain spice that is called the metagita pepper. And this was hot, it was hot commodity. So the Portuguese followed that, and that's how they got to the western coast of Africa, and where it's called Liberia today. They named that west coast of Africa Costa de Pimenta, which means the coast of pepper. So the European traders also, while they were after this commodity, discovered a more lucrative business, which was the slave trade at that time, and they got involved in it. So the first slaves that were sold on the market in Jamestown, Virginia, the number of them were only 19. So these 19 slaves from West Africa arrived to the United States. It's believed to be between the 15th to the 16th century. And then between that or 1800, slave trade started to really flourish in the West. So by 1800, in the middle of slave trade down in the United States here, there was a group of white Americans who started to feel that slavery wasn't right after all. So they started to get together and oppose this trade. So by 1816, a group of these Americans went together and started what is called ACS, which is the American Colonization Society. And what this group was about was that they were to help to abolish slavery, ultimately, on the continent of America. So they started this, and then later on now, as these slaves were being freed, they had another problem. They didn't know what to do about these freed men of color. So they went together and started having meetings and decided that the best thing to do, because in the South, the former slave masters did not agree to integrate with these freed men. And so they were left with other parts of the United States. But the Midwest, that many of them were thinking about heading, was not even ready to accept them. So in that predicament, ACS decided to send these free slaves back to Africa, where they would go and live. Among the best known members of the ACS were Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John Randall. Presidents like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were also public supporters of this plan. ACS's plan was not for these free slaves to just go to Africa and just find a place to live, but they wanted these Africans to go and colonize Africa. And I think there was a fundamental mistake in that. That mistake is going to haunt the life of this country, Liberia, probably for the rest of its life or for centuries to come. So by 1818, the ACS Society sent 2 men from the United States to go to Africa, to West Africa, to go and look for a suitable place for these free slaves to go. But when they went, excuse me, they went to arrange with the king, the tribal king in Liberia. When they got there, they sat down and they tried to talk about purchasing land from the king, the local king. But the king refused upon the grounds that these people who were coming were not familiar. They didn't know them. They saw them as people who were coming to encroach upon their land. So they refused the deal. And so this team of scouts from the United States had to return back to the United States. Meanwhile, more slaves have been freed in the United States, and the problem of really knowing what to do about their condition as they grew was not reducing. So by 1820, about 88 of these freed men, plus 3 American government officials, sailed to West Africa, but this time they went to the country of Sierra Leone, which is next door to Liberia. When they got to Sierra Leone, they went to an island off the coast of Sierra Leone called Sherbrooke Island. Apparently it was an island that was not being inhabited. So they went there and carried these 88 slaves and tried to resettle them there. In a short time, half of the 88 that went was killed by malaria because their bodies were not yet acclimated to the area and to malaria. So when that happened, in 1821, the U.S. Navy came back to West Africa, the Navy ship came back to West Africa and started going around to find a better place for the remaining slaves to be resettled, and then that would serve as a more permanent place of residence for the rest of the returning slaves. So again, the captain of the Navy ship went and sat down with the local king to negotiate for land. And they were going back and forth, and it wasn't working again. And so what the captain did was that at a certain point, out of frustration, he got up, took his pistol, and pointed directly at the head of the king. And said, either you put your fingerprint on this document or I blow your head. And obviously, the king had to agree, and so the Navy ship returned to the United States. It wasn't a good deal because, again, this deal is going to haunt the history of Liberia for many, many generations. The mistake there was that Liberia's land was being taken by force. That's what the natives felt. And then again, when these people were settled in Liberia, the instruction to them was to colonize their fellow Africans. And this will pose a serious problem for these free men of color who are looking for a home. So the local tribes will attack these people over and over and over until in 1824 they decided to build some fortification in an enclave of Liberia, about 70 miles radius along the coastal area of that country where they dwell. But they were still being attacked by the natives. But that 70-mile radius where they live, they call that area Liberia. And then eventually, they called the capital city of that little place Monrovia, after President James Monroe, because at a certain point, President James Monroe raised enough money to support this project of colonization. So Liberia then became a new settlement for the free slaves from the United States, and even slaves that were intercepted on the ocean on their way to slave market in the United States after the abolition of slavery. By 1838, the total number of slaves now in this place called Liberia was about 20,000 free slaves, and even Africans who were intercepted on the ocean. But there's a saying that hurting people hurt people. So already these slaves they were faced with all kinds of inhumane conditions in slavery, and now that they are free and they have been asked to come and colonize Africa, so there was always tension between them and the natives of this country. So at a certain point, as they ruled Liberia, they decided not to integrate with the natives. That was a fundamental mistake. As for the natives, they felt that these people were not the same as they, because they have been out in the United States here for over 200 to 300 years, and now many of them, they don't look like the typical Africans anymore. They didn't speak the language, they didn't have their culture. But the mistake from the beginning was that there should have been a way to make peace between these two groups of people that were going to dwell together. So the free slaves from the United States considered themselves as civilized and superior to the indigenous people. They considered themselves as people who were the elites of this country. The indigenous people, on the other hand, were considered as inferior and servants to these free slaves. It's ironic. It's really ironic that something like that could even happen. So they kept apart for generations. Schools that were built in Liberia were only built along the coastal area for the children of these free slaves. Liberians were not included in any political thing because they felt that they were not intelligent, and in fact, at a certain point, native Liberians were denied birthright to citizenship in their own country, Liberia. Many people don't know this. So, but this went on, this will go on from the about 1820 all the way till 1980. Look at this span of years that this sort of thing has been going on. This bad blood has been going on between the natives and the African American returnees, because that's actually what these men were. And you will find out that some of the first government officials of Liberia, from among these people, the first president, James Roberts, was from Virginia. He's a citizen of Virginia. Others were from Philadelphia and other places. So on April 12, 1980, a group of enlisted soldiers from the armed forces of Liberia rose up, and they went to the executive mansion and they killed the president, thereby bringing an end to about 140 years of African American rule in Liberia. A new problem arose. These men who went and did this insurgents were not educated. They were not experienced leaders. They were just, most of them were just enlisted men in the army. In fact, the master sergeant who led this whole group was a junior high dropout. And he was considered as one of the most educated ones among them. Now, the country is about to be in the hands of these people. So you can already imagine what Liberia will go through during the first 5 years of the rule of this military rule. Things became terrible. And it's all because of this denial of basic rights to education for the natives. So that right only belonged to those who were of the elite class. The first 5 years was a disaster. It was rigged with corruption and human rights abuses. It was so bad that the United States government had to come in and tell the military government that they have to change to a civilian rule. So in 1985, the military leader had to encourage an electoral process, and there was an election, and Jimmy Carter and some representatives from the government here went to Liberia to oversee this process. But that election, even under the noses of the United States Embassy and Jimmy Carter and U.S. representatives, that election was rigged in favor of the military president, who all he had to do was just to change his uniform and put on a civilian suit. And so he will rule this country for the next 5 years. Meanwhile, and we talk about systemic corruption and all kinds of things, murder, all kinds of things. But meanwhile, the United States government will give a total grant of $500 million to this government over time. About a third of that 500 million grant will go into the pockets of these military / civilian leaders, thereby bringing that country down in a terrible way. So 4 years later, in 1989, a guy by the name of Charles Taylor, you saw a guy here in the film that was dressed in uniform with the helmet and everything, and he's talking about how he's going to fight and all of that, flanked by other uniform figures. This was the guy called Charles Taylor. At this time, he was working in the government. He was the one in charge of government procurement of government properties. So he took the presidential limousine that apparently had a mechanical fault, put it on the ship, brought it to the United States. They found an expert mechanic who took care of it, but that should have just been done in Liberia, as simple as anything. So after he got it fixed, then he sold it and pocketed the money. Liberian government will report to the U.S. government, and then they will apprehend this guy and they will jail him outside of Boston in a maximum prison. One night, 2 men will appear in the prison with all the travel documents and let this guy loose. And so he flew to Africa. But as a fugitive, there was nowhere for him to rest. So he gathered some guys who had run away from the pressure back home in Liberia. Most of them were former military guys. He would collect them, put them on the train, and carry them to North Africa, to Libya, and be trained by Muammar Gaddafi, of all persons. On December 23rd, 1989, this group of crack commandos, trained by Gaddafi, were unleashed on Liberia. They crossed the border in the middle of Christmas Eve festivities, and they attacked the garrison along the border. And that will be the beginning of a bloodbath that will go down in history as one of probably modern day's worst. At the end of the Civil War, around 2003 to 2004, over 270 to 290,000 Liberians who have lost their lives. And that affects every Liberian that you see, either directly or residually. Many things will happen in the process. All this time, from the beginning of Liberia's history that I've laid out up to about 1980 and through 1980 to the Civil War. Civil War even made the situation worse. But education has never been a priority of the government of Liberia. The future of Liberia has never been on the forefront of the Liberian government. So when the war came, many of the young people who have been denied basic education were easy targets for the rebel leaders, because they would go to them and promise that Liberia will be all right after the government is overthrown. The US dollar would just flow like a river in Liberia. Everybody was going to be rich. And so these kids, many of them who have not been opportunity to go to school, and even those who were able to go to school, all wanted a piece of this pie that was somewhere out there. And so they pick up arms. Some were forced, but hundreds of thousands of young people, some as young as 10 years old. If you were to see this video a little further, you will see some of these kids. There was a young man in one of the documentaries who admitted that he was 7 years old when he started. So this kid could hardly bear the gun that he had. And these young people will be trained only for about 2 weeks and then sent off to the battlefront to serve mainly as human sandbags against the advancing forces of the West African Intervention Army and the US-trained Liberian Army. To talk about the present day Liberia, I will very briefly say here that when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, after elections in 2006, and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the Harvard graduate and an economist who worked with IMF for many years, is known in most places around the world. She was involved in that election and she won. And it was very good because at the very heel of the Liberian Civil War, Liberia didn't need one of these men, these political demagogues or these rebel leaders to take over the country. Liberia needed somebody who would come there and play like a motherly role, and that's what she did. And she did that pretty well, stabilizing the country. But all this time, nothing is being laid down for the future generation in Liberia. During this 15 years of civil war, an entire generation of young people in Liberia missed school. So they matured during this period of time. They were exposed to violence during this time. And by the time the war was over, many of them were young adults already. They had not known any other life except this life of violence and disorder. That generation, after Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, with the backing of the international community, has served Liberia and stabilized the country and carried on a little bit of development here and there. Her term was over, and last year an election was held, and a guy who won this election, his name is Weah. He's the current president of Liberia. This guy was not a politician. In fact, this guy is not even a college graduate. I'm hearing that he somehow fixed on a college degree paper somehow. But we knew him as somebody who's not a college graduate. One skill he had, and he was really good at that skill, was soccer. So at one point, he became the world #1 soccer player. And he won a lot of awards for that. He played all over Europe and Asia. He had some money. When he came to Liberia, this generation that have made school, that have made the most part of their development process, is scattered all over the street in Liberia with no hope for the future. Now that was the demographic that this guy chose to go to. And so he would promise to get their food here. In fact, my wife and I watched a certain documentary where they were cooking rice out in big pots. And these street kids were all over, hundreds of them, and they were feeding them rice. They were putting rice, they didn't have dishes, so they were putting rice in their hands, and they were eating it. So these were the kids who ran for this guy. That was the majority population that took this guy to presidency in Liberia. And so today, as we speak today, the reason why I said I could talk about the history of Liberia, I could say a little bit about present condition in Liberia. But I don't have very much to say about the future, because as I stand here and look, I find that all of this history, throughout all this history, nothing substantial has been laid out as a foundation for the future of this country. This is why my heart burns. This is why I cry for that little country all the time. And if there's any hope for that country, for some of us, what we see is that education and training is the way forward for Liberia. That schools, that quality schools, that will have life skills that will be taught to many of these young people so that they can contribute. The government of Liberia, as far as many of us are concerned, is incapacitated to lead Liberia into the future. I just feel that it is individual help, it is private sector that is going to carry that country, and the most important thing to emphasize on in Liberia will be education and skills for young people in Liberia. So when anybody's thinking about helping Liberia, it should not be like thinking about giving them quick fixes. During the Civil War and post-war era, the international did well. They brought a lot of food and they brought a lot of relief supplies. That, where we stand now, is not going to help Liberia. We need something more futuristic, some preparation of the younger generation today in Liberia to help build that country. Let me stop.